Orcs are no longer in the monster manual. Kinda. Strap in. It's Dungeon Craft. Welcome to Dungeon Craft. I'm Professor DM, and this channel is about all things tabletop role-playing games. Deathbringer, tell them what they should do.
Like, subscribe, bell, comment, newsletter, Facebook, X, and Patreon for bonus content.
So the big news is Orcs do not have a dedicated page in the 2025 Monster Manual. They are relegated to the appendices. This reflects their elevation from monster to one of the playable species. And I use the term species because that's what Hasbro uses. Hasbro, Wizards of the Coast, own the IP for Dungeons & Dragons. If they say it's a species, I'm going to call it a species. If I review a game where it's called a race, I will call it that. Now, this version of D&D, the one I first played with, describes orcs as ugly human-like creatures who look like a combination of animal and man. They have bad tempers and do not like living things. They will often kill something for their own amusement. They also hate light and suffer a -1 penalty to fight in daylight. Their alignment is chaotic, which in this version means evil. To discuss AD&D orcs, I'm going to call in an authority on the subject, Angry Dwarf.
A lot of misinformation out there on the internet, with people calling these orcs. This is not an orc. This is an orc. Notice the pig head. Real orcs look like pigs. This is not an orc. This is an orc. Clans include the Vile Rune, Broken Bone, and Evil Eye. This is not an orc. This is a green elf. Some people say orcs can join the party and be a friend. Don't believe them. Orcs don't want to be a friend. Orcs want to eat your face. Once I knew a first-level wizard, fresh out of university. Thought he knew everything. Let's talk to the orcs first, he said. Maybe they're peaceful orcs. They chopped off his head and used it as a hand puppet!
These orcs are ripped straight from Tolkien, whose orcs are hostile monsters. The term orc is a derivation of the word ogre. In The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings, orcs are described inconsistently. In some places, Morgoth creates them. In others, they're corrupt elves, and their features are not well described. Tolkien gets into more detail in his letters, but I don't consider those canon because they're not actually in the books. In Moria, Samwise stabs an orc in the foot, and it's described as having scales, and the blood is black, suggesting the orcs might be reptilian in nature. We don't really know. It's left to our imaginations, and in my opinion, I think it's better that way. Uruk-hai are half-orcs bred by Saruman, but the breeding takes place off-screen. In his Two Towers film, Peter Jackson has the Uruk-hai born from a mud-covered amniotic sac. Clearly, Tolkien and Jackson wanted to avoid the sticky question of, are there any orc moms and orc kids? Orcs without families allow them to take on the role of stormtroopers in the Star Wars films. They're a faceless enemy that can be slaughtered without mercy because they are evil. Following the release of D&D in the 1970s, orcs became a staple in the TTRPG world, appearing in Tunnels and Trolls and Warhammer, where they became green. Today's D&D orcs are a kinder, gentler, light gray skin nomadic culture, and they've been shifted from the Monster Manual to the Player's Handbook, where they're one of the canonical playable species. But how did we get here? We'll talk about that in a second, but first I want to tell you about our sponsor, Green Dragon Fest. Have you ever wanted to play tabletop role-playing games with your favorite content creators and game designers in a venue straight out of a fantasy novel? Now's your chance at Green Dragon Fest, May 1st through the 4th at Ancient Lore Village in Knoxville, Tennessee. Play alongside Emmy Award winner Kelsey Dion, Justin Alexander, DM Scotty, Bob Worldbuilder, and of course me, Professor DM. Admission is all-inclusive and you can upgrade to stay at the Village. At the time of this recording, only 8 accommodations and 22 tickets remain, so get your ticket at greendragonfest.com at the link below before ticket sales end on March 30th. See you in May, Dragon Raiders. So how did D&D orcs go from being a monster to a playable species? In my opinion, it has to do with World of Warcraft. In 2004, Warcraft debuted, became an international sensation, and orcs were a playable species. In the 2016 World of Warcraft movie, the hero is an orc, and at the conclusion, orcs, elves, and dwarves form an alliance. Today's D&D audience grew up on these orcs. If the modern audience is familiar with Lord of the Rings, it's mostly because of the movies. When I was a teenager, everyone playing D&D read Lord of the Rings. It was like the Bible. And when I say everyone, I mean everyone. I never met a person that didn't read that book series. But my kids, although they are familiar with Lord of the Rings, they've never read the books. My sons have only watched the movies. Dungeons & Dragons has always been anachronistic, snatching bits of weapons and food from different time periods and mixing and matching, stealing monsters, magic items, and even its spell system from pulp fantasy novels, Arthurian legend, Greek mythology, and Hammer horror films. It's always been a mashup. The depiction of orcs in popular culture has shifted, so it's shifting in D&D too. And it's all about giving the players the option to play what they want to play. In the OG DMG, Gary Gygax dedicates an entire 2-page spread to the idea of playing monsters as player characters. He doesn't forbid it, but he cautions against it. Monster player characters should start at first level and be as weak as any other first level character and grow into their powers as they rise in levels. They would also have to contend with a frightened population who would regard them as, a monster. And this shows us two things. One, even back in the 70s, players wanted to play monsters. And two, he put it in the DMG, but not the player's handbook, so as to avoid arguments. It was a concept for the DM to consider carefully. The 2024 Player's Handbook presents orcs as a playable species, but to avoid accusations of bioessentialism, they've avoided attaching stat bonuses to species. Instead, ability scores are aligned with your character's occupation. Dwarves aren't naturally stout, but a dwarf miner would be. And turtle people aren't slower than anyone else. Essentially, every character is a variant human. People can look like an elf, dwarf, orc, dragon, demon, turtle, or cat, and it's all normal. Everyone is a superhero in a vaguely medieval Ren Fair fantasy world where demons are just accepted. It's like, oh, there goes a demon guy. Hi, demon guy.
Hey, you guys want to go to IHOP, get some breakfast or something?
That's the lore now. So it's not surprising to me that orcs have been removed from the monster manual. 10 years ago, I ran a Monopoly club at my high school, and my players were thrilled that the new version of Monopoly had eliminated the iron token and replaced it with a cat and a helicopter. I had one student, Alice, who loved cats. She was happy moving the cat around the board, collecting property, and hoarding her money. She never traded, so she always lost. But it took a long time, and she was happy. She just wanted to play the cat. These changes were preceded by years of market research, and that market research showed younger players liked cats and helicopters. That's why Tasha's Cauldron introduced rules for what are essentially Pokemon pets, and Strixhaven is a mashup of Hogwarts and Dimension 20's Fantasy High. The lore of Dungeons & Dragons is not sacred to the bean counters in Hasbro's C-suite. If kids want beholders to be cute, they will be cutified. Easier to sell beholder plushies. The challenge for D&D is it's a slippery slope. What if players want to play gnolls or trolls or bugbears or gelatinous cubes? In a world where you can play anything, nothing is a monster. And if nothing is a monster, who do you fight? And this is not me hating on Hasbro. I'm making the observation. This is a corporation acting corporate-y. So what's the answer? Are orcs evil? Is hating on them racist? Hold your fire in the comments. I'm going to give you the one true definitive answer. Kinda, sorta, maybe. That all depends. I've linked 2 great videos below. Is a Goblin a Person by Grungeon Master and How RPGs Turned Goblins into People by Innovation in RPGs. These are thoughtful, well-reasoned videos that tackle this complex subject. I'm going to give you the Cliff Notes version. If you allow your players to play orcs, if they are a playable species, then the answer is yes. But they're not really orcs. The orc is just a variant of human. But if you say orcs are monsters that eat humans and cannot interbreed with them, then the answer is no. Tolkien, Warcraft, Dungeons & Dragons are not authorities on orcs because orcs don't exist. In the anime Goblin Slayer, the title character saves a cleric after her party is viciously slaughtered by goblins. But before leaving the cave, he makes a point to find the goblin children and club them to death. And the cleric asks if he really has to kill the children, and aren't there any good goblins? And he responds, there might be a good goblin if you look really hard. But to me, the only good goblin is the one that doesn't come out of its hole. That take goes hard. This is a very grimdark world, but it's equally valid because goblins aren't real. It's like vampires. In Coppola's version of Dracula, the vampire is a doomed, tragic, romantic hero. In Robert Eggers' Nosferatu, and spoiler alert if you haven't seen the film, Robert Eggers' Nosferatu is a rapist who guzzles blood and kills children. It is unambiguous. He is a monster. Each director presents their variant of the same story, and each is equally valid. As the game master, you're kind of the director of your game. So the ultimate authority on orcs is you. If you want to think of orcs as a variant human culture that gets along with all the other species, that's fine. That's legit. And if you're into beer and pretzels gaming and want orcs to be a monstrous villain that your players can kill indiscriminately and not feel bad about it, that's equally legit. I think Dungeons & Dragons could have avoided this in two ways. One is just not allowed orcs as a playable species. The other is to offer a disclaimer. Similar to where a movie states any resemblance between characters and real people is purely coincidental. That would have squashed this whole debate, and I don't know why they didn't do that. In a way, this conversation is kind of absurd because it presumes, as a starting point, that there is a definitive version of Dungeons & Dragons. I don't believe that. If you're new to the hobby space, you should know Wizards of the Coast owns the IP. That is the most popular version right now. But there's at least 11 other editions of it and tons of variants. In my variant, Deathbringer, all characters are human and orcs are described as pig-faced orcs. They are monsters, and that's a conscious choice by me, the designer, because I don't want you to feel bad about killing them. But that's what I think. What do you think? Share in the comments below, but please be nice to each other. Now, you can get the starter version of Deathbringer at the link below, where it's an adamantium bestseller on DriveThruRPG, and sign up for the Deathbringer newsletter below for when we launch the full game. We'll continue this discussion on Patreon. Thanks to all the patrons for making this content possible. We'll see you soon. May all your rolls be 20s.
Where there's a whip, there's a way. Those are my favorite orcs, the singing orcs. For more great content, watch Tomb of Horrors and the Lost City. We don't want to go to war today, but the Lord of the Lash says nay, nay, nay.